Welcome everybody. I'm glad you're all here. Just a couple of quick things about how this webinar is going to work. We will have the chat open and the Q&A, and I will be monitoring that throughout the day or event. And then we'll have that after the lecture is presented, and I will kind of coordinate that, moderate it, and relay those questions on to Laurel. So if you want to have those come through during the lecture, that's great, but we'll just save the questions till the end, okay? Kelly, do you want to go ahead and introduce the lecture?
Absolutely. So welcome to the 38th annual Juanita Brooks Lecture Series. This lecture series began many years ago thanks to the generosity of the O.C. Tanner Foundation and celebrates Southern Utah, our rich history, and one of our most cherished historians, Juanita Brooks. I would like to thank the Juanita Brooks Lecture Series Advisory Committee, and in particular our Special Collections Librarian, Kathleen Broder. So Kathleen, would you please introduce tonight's guest?
Yeah, so it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She's personally one of my favorites, and she's been really great to work with, but she is also the 300th anniversary University Professor Emerita at Harvard University, and is probably best known for A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary from 1785 to 1812, which won a Pulitzer Prize for History and a lot of other awards in 1991. Many of us know her for her sentence that escaped from one of her scholarly articles that became a popular slogan and a basis of her 2000 book, Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History. I have it on my bumper. Her most recent book is A House Full of Women, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism between 1835 and 1870, which explores the paradoxical link between the practice of polygamy or plural marriage in Utah Territory and the adoption in 1870 of women's suffrage. Professor Ulrich has received numerous awards for teaching, scholarship, and public service, including the MacArthur Fellow, the Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Award from the Society of American Historians, and the Charles Frankel Award. She is a past president of the American Historical Association and an elected member of the American Philosophical Association and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Ulrich on her presentation about Juanita Brooks, Caroline Crosby, and the murder of Olivia Coombs, which will then be followed with that Q&A session. So questions, please send through the chat, and we'll address those after her presentation tonight, okay? Go ahead, Dr. Ulrich.
Okay, thanks so much, Kathleen. I've really enjoyed working with you, and you've been a great help to me as we've worked through various drafts of the longer version of this talk this evening. I'd also like to thank the anonymous readers on your committee who gave me some great suggestions, and various colleagues who have done a lot to help me with this project. Melanie Sturgeon, Barbara Jones-Brown, Kim Cannon, Leah Lyman, and others. I really appreciate your help, whoever has conferred with me on this very complicated topic that I've taken on. I have to admit that when I came up with a title and a topic way back when, I had no idea that I would be giving this lecture in the middle of another national time of mourning because of mass murders in our society. And one of the things that I've learned over the past few days, I've been reminded of, is that most murders are individual. Mass murders, a minority of those who are killed in mass events like those that took place in Colorado and Georgia in the last 10 days or so. But often these large events cast a very strong shadow over small events. And sometimes they get in our way of really understanding what the fundamental problems are that we need to address. And that may or may not be true in the topic I'm discussing this evening, but I am going to be talking about the murder of a single individual that took place in the 4 or 5 years after the famous massacre at Mountain Meadows, with which I think most of those in this audience tonight are quite familiar with. So I'm going to share my screen with good luck. And see if I can turn on my slideshow. I hope that's visible to everyone. Is it there, Kathleen? Are we all
It is.
set?
We are seeing your screen, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, the story that I'm going to tell you tonight is a kind of detective story, but it's not a whodunit. George Woods freely admitted that he killed Olivia Coombs and wounded her daughter, Emily, in Cedar City, Utah on July 28, 1862. He pled guilty at trial. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. That should have been the end of the story. But less than 3 years later, Utah's governor, responding to a petition signed by 200 of the territory's male citizens, granted Wood a full and complete pardon. He apparently went back home and picked up his former life. He died in Cedar City, Utah in 1908, a respected businessman, rancher, and pioneer. His log cabin sits today in Frontier Homestead State Park in Cedar City, where it is touted as the oldest surviving structure in Utah. Don't know if that's true, but it's an interesting claim. For Olivia Coombs, there was no such redemption. Her children grew up in the homes of strangers, and her story survived only in the rippled recollections of her descendants. But in 1950, Juanita Brooks gave the murder a small place in history by adding to a footnote in her landmark book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, a story told by Olivia's granddaughter, a woman named Olive Branch Milburn. No one picked up on that story. And that's hardly surprising, because at the time, most people didn't pay much attention to Juanita Brooks' book either. In the 1950s, pioneer stories had to be uplifting. In fact, in 1953, Milburn published a comprehensive history of her own family that avoided any mention of her grandmother's murder. It simply said that she died young. To borrow a passage from Toni Morrison, remembering seemed unwise. This was not a story to pass on. That changed by the end of the 20th century as new attitudes toward history emerged. And by 2000, the Mountain Meadow Massacre was very much part of public discourse, and the emergence of online research in family history drew attention on the part of some of Olivia Coombs' descendants to the footnote in Brooks' book. Today, genealogical websites like Family Search and Find a Grave tell various convoluted versions of the story. As yet, however, there has been little scholarly interest in the topic. I'm going to take a stab at it this evening, and I hope other scholars will follow. I'm going to essentially tell it by looking at 3 different versions of the story. The first, Olive Branch Milburn's tale that she shared with Juanita Brooks sometime before the book was published in 1950. Then I'm going to turn to 2 sources that I don't believe either Milburn or Brooks had access to in 1950. A letter to Brigham Young written by Cedar City Bishop Henry Lunt, which was written just a few days after the murder. And then I'm going to turn to one of my favorite sources, a work that I gave an entire chapter to in A House Full of Females, and that is the diary of Caroline Barnes Crosby. So we'll start with Milburn. She believed her grandmother was killed because she was too interested in the Mountain Meadow Massacre. She told Brooks that her grandmother had come to Cedar City, a widow with 2 small daughters, and set up a school there. She acted too interested in the incident, asked too many questions about it, and word went out that she was collecting evidence and planned to publish her findings. At a small hotel next to her school, men gathered to visit and drink. One morning, she was being discussed there as a wolf in sheep's clothing, pretending to teach their children while she tried to fasten crimes on their parents. In the crowd was George Wood. He had been drinking and became much excited by the talk. And when someone suggested that his son was interested in Olivia's 13-year-old daughter, he stalked out, went to the door of the house adjoining, opened it, and shot the mother twice before the crowd realized what had happened. Although Brooks, in the revised edition of her book, published in the early 60s, added a little footnote to the Utah State Papers that contained the text of the governor's pardon of Wood. I don't believe she went beyond that. I doubt if she ever saw any detailed description of the murder or of the crime. And as I said before, I'm quite sure she didn't see the letter that Henry Lunt sent to Brigham Young. Lunt said that on the morning of the murder, he was in his dooryard sharpening his scythe before beginning work, when George Wood's daughter came rushing to his yard and asked him to come quickly. Thinking there was illness in the family, he hurried to the Wood farm. He went into the parlor, and he said that Wood came in, shut the door, and told me that his son Joseph and a certain girl down in the old fort, the oldest section of Cedar City, had committed adultery. and that the girl had seduced Joseph. He said that he had been told that very morning by two women who said they had seen the couple in the very act. Lunt asked him to calm down, and when his counselor in the bishopric arrived, he asked Wood to tell the story again, and he said, you know, there is safety in counsel. Wood answered, he didn't want any counsel, and he stormed out of the house. The two men went out and discovered that he had gotten on his horse and had headed down to the old fort. They ran after him, but before they had gone near to the old area of the old fort, they saw Wood returning from the opposite direction, and he said, Bishop, I have killed two women, and I want you to see that they are buried. And, says he, by the eternal gods, anyone who interferes with my family again, I will serve them in the same way. Now, there are two very important points made in these speeches to Bishop Lunt. Wood talked about his son having been seduced. And then in the second speech, he claimed his right to control his own family. And as we'll see later, both of these themes, the theme of seduction and the theme of patriarchal authority, impinge eventually on the pardon, because intentionally or not, and I think it was intentional, Wood, who was British, Lunt was also British, they understood the so-called unwritten law, which prevailed both in Great Britain and in the United States, that claimed that the head of a household, the male head of the household, was entitled to protect the dependents in his family, typically a wife or a daughter who had been, quote, seduced. And legal historians tell us that in the 19th century, no man who murdered a wife or a daughter's seducer, or sometimes sisters, had ever been convicted of murder. And this is a very strange reversal, because in this case, Lunt is claiming direct vengeance on the seduction of his son. Now, Lunt's story continues, and it adds to the drama of the murder by describing the wound from the bullet that entered the right thigh of Olivia Coombs, about midway between her knee and hip, passing in the direction of her body, coming out of the groin, and immediately entering the body just above the pubic bone in the region of the bladder. Now, he tried to explain to Brigham Young that this strange direction of the shot was caused by the fact that Olivia and her daughter were seated on a mattress on the floor in the old fort. But that makes no sense to me. If his goal was to kill them, he could have directed it at their head or their heart. He was marking the body, marking a sexual crime. His pistol, his revolver misfired. Bullet did not revolve after the first 3 shots. And so, as Lunt explains, the daughter Emily received the first bullet in her right thigh, but then Wood tried to complete the job by striking her with 4 dangerous wounds from the handle of his pistol. She did, in fact, amazingly survive, but the mother was dead. Now, Lund adds a very interesting wrinkle by giving a kind of profile of the woman he calls Mrs. Higbee. He points out that since coming from California in 1858, she had had 4 husbands, as he calls them. She had been formally married to a man named Coombs. When she came to Utah, she was again married to Solomon Chamberlain. She then was married to Thomas Hunt, who is now in Salt Lake City. And then this spring, he says, she married again to Ezra Higbee, who is now in this place, that is Cedar City, attending Brother E. Snow's carding machine. Remarkable in 4 years attachment to 4 different men, none of whom seems to be present to avenge or protect her. He's making an implication, I think, that is spelled out in a letter written the same week by George A. Smith to the judge of the probate court, asking that would be given bail, in part because the county had no jail. But he ends his letter by saying, I think the killing of such a whore benefits the community enough to render the case bailable. And the judge convicted him, and the jury, the grand jury. He pled guilty. It looked like a slam dunk case. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor, but as we saw, he served a very short period. And it is clear that though the petition appealed to certain technical grounds for pardon that probably were essential to get the non-Mormon governor's approval, the territorial governor, the petition gathered from 200 people, including members of the grand jury, the judge himself, and a couple of apostles, really depended on this notion of the unwritten law about the patriarch's authority. It claimed that Olive Higbee had kept a house of ill fame in the town of Beaver. She had tried to decoy away youth in Cedar, and by the aid of her daughter, did beguile and lead away a boy of 18 years. Now, it's a fascinating story, and it leads us immediately to ask, what do we know about prostitution, houses of ill repute in early Utah? In fact, there's nothing written in the period before 1870. And there's been little scholarship because most historians assume that in sharp contrast to other surrounding Western territories, there was very little of it. I think that in towns like Cedar City and Beaver, where church and state were intertwined, it is hard to imagine anything as formal as a brothel. But I doubt that any form of surveillance could have totally prevented some kind of illicit sexual encounters, or discouraged perhaps a really desperate woman from engaging in some way with a passing immigrant, or perhaps specifically with a passing soldier. And there were soldiers coming through Beaver in the 58 and 59, and by 62, we're now in the Civil War, but there are soldiers stationed in the territory. So I think the question becomes, were there particular circumstances in this case, or perhaps predilections on the part of the victim, that allowed this to us outrageous petition without any kind of due process, transforming George Wood's violence into Olivia Coombs' shame. There's a little bit of very interesting material in the diary of Caroline Crosby. And I want to just emphasize here the kind of diary this is. Not a lot of opinions in Caroline's diary, but lots of observation. It is just an amazing diary for people like me who like to sort of unpack the nature of social relations in a small community. Her patient recounting of community life among Latter-day Saints in California and later in Beaver, Utah, portrays the miseries of pioneering, the trials of monogamy, as well as the much more commonly discussed problems of polygamy. She was engaged, she listened. And so she recorded stories, for example, of Eleanor McLean, the respectable wife and mother who in San Francisco fled her alcoholic husband to become Parley Pratt's ninth wife. And of course, Pratt then became a victim of the unwritten law when her husband killed him. She and San Bernardino testified in a contentious divorce trial involving a one-time church leader who was living openly with a prostitute. In Beaver, she comforted all sorts of women, including a weeping mother who had no breast milk for her newborn baby and whose husband went to the stockyard to sleep in order to get away from the baby's crying. The distraught women who shared their stories with Caroline suffered from anxiety, depression, abuse, discontent, and sheer exhaustion as they struggled to hold life together in a seemingly endless succession of makeshift settings. Nobody really had a finished house in these little, either in San Bernardino or in these little Utah towns. Everything is in the process of becoming, and there's a constant flow of people in and out of the community. It's amazing how they hold life together, have celebrations, have fun, enjoy themselves under the circumstances in which they live. So what do we learn about Olivia Coombs? Well, one thing, she's a pretty normal member of the community. Has relatives who are members of the church. She's a convert. She's come on the ship Brooklyn to California. And it's really helpful because of the kind of detail in Caroline's diary. We kind of get her family straight by putting together just little random entries in Caroline's diary with what we can get from scarce census records. We know that she and her husband Abraham had 6 children, the oldest a boy who remained in Napa, California when the family moved to San Bernardino and then to Utah. But when the youngest was born in December 1856, Caroline recorded that she had another daughter, which makes her 5 in number and only 1 son. Helen had already become a household helper. She's now about 13 or 14, and she becomes Caroline's household helper. And Caroline mentions the other little girls by name, gives their ages, and interacts with them in various ways. And this seems like a pretty normal, neighborly, not intimate, in an intense way, but certainly friendly relationship. But shortly after the birth of little Olive, trouble begins. And don't know whether it's postpartum depression, problems with resources, but Olivia begins to share feelings with Caroline about wanting to leave her husband, wanting to go to the hills to cook for the men at the lumber yard, wanting to get a separation. And Caroline discourages her from doing that. I mean, she's got all these kids. How is she going to handle that? In California, divorce is an adversarial, it's possible, but it's adversarial, as Caroline knows very well from her prior experience. And so she discourages her. And then there's a real crisis in March 1857 when Helen leaves Caroline's house to go to school and stops at her parents' house and then comes back summoning Caroline to come quick. Caroline immediately races to the Coombs house and she finds it's true. Olivia is entirely helpless from what Caroline calls intemperate drinking. She lay prostrate on the bed, her babe lying by her side, and the other three little girls standing around looking sad and forsaken. I know not that I ever saw a more pitiful sight. Caroline picks up the baby, takes the 2-year-old by the hand, takes them back to her house, and tells 10-year-old Emily to look after little Arabella, and if they get hungry or need anything, to come to her house. And she becomes a kind of backup system for the Coombs family. In April, the local physician comes to the house and tells her that he's been to visit Arabella, who's been quite ill, and found the mother in a state of intoxication. And he asked her to let Helen leave and go back to help her mother and stay a while with Arabella. Now, Caroline has one child, is only unable to have others. She's constantly taking children in as a kind of foster situation. Anybody who needs help, she's done it again and again, even in the South Pacific when she served as a missionary there. And so it seems rather natural for her to offer to take Elvira, the 2-year-old, and raise her as her own, to become a mother to her. And both parents seem interested in that. And Caroline is thrilled. She tells her friends, look at my beautiful baby. In a couple of months, that doesn't seem to be working out. And Olivia sends a note to Caroline's house saying that she and Abraham have reconciled and they've decided to go back to Napa, California, where they left their son and a stepdaughter. And they want to take all their children with her. And she then comes to the house to talk to Caroline about it. And Caroline said she appeared very dejected. Again, Caroline urges her not to do that. But Olivia said no, she's really determined she wants to do this, and that the idea of giving away her little one made her very unhappy day and night. So Caroline's husband asked Abraham Coombs to come and discuss the situation. And when he arrives, Caroline asks him how his wife is doing. And he says, bad enough, doesn't know what to do. He hoped to reconcile with her by telling her to bring all the children back, but he's just not sure what's going to happen. And then in a very uncharacteristic bit of gossip in the diary, Caroline says that Helen had informed her previously that after the conversation earlier that day, her mother had gone home, sent Emily to the store for a bottle of brandy, and had been drinking. They decide to leave, and Helen decides to go with them. Carolyn makes one last attempt, being unable to do anything on her own. She sits Helen and Emily down and she gives them a little sermon. And I think her language is fascinating here. I gave them both a charge to be kind to their little sisters and take good care of them when their mother was in her helpless state. When the family leaves, she admits that she's exhausted and feels relieved. Now we hear nothing about the Coombs family for more than a year. In that time, many people are leaving Beaver to move to Utah. The Crosbys leave. And we find the Coombs family again in Beaver, Utah. And we know they're there because of, and we know how long Olivia stays because of two public documents. One from the Beaver probate court, and I thank Melanie Sturgeon for finding this and sharing it with me, that she, in August, she petitions for divorce from Abraham. And she uses the very liberal grounds that are typical in Utah, that she's entirely alienated from him, cannot live with him in peace and union. Her welfare requires a separation. She gets custody of her children, all the household furniture, and half of a wheat crop, then standing in the ground. She's mentioned again in a public document in Beaver in July 1860. She's listed there as the head of the household, age 42, washerwoman with the three youngest daughters. Now, Caroline's diary fills in between those 2 points, that 2-year point that she stays in Beaver. And here are just 4 very quick items. In April 1859, the town comes to the Crosbys. They have not seen the Coombs family at all. And they ask if they will take the little child again that they once had given us by Brother Coombs, now deceased, because they expected they would need to take the children from their mother in consequence of her evil habits and bind them out. This would have been little Elvira, who would now be 4 years old. And Caroline said, yes, she would take her. But I think Olivia turned that idea down. And for good reason. She came up with another solution. February 11th, she appears at the Crosby house as Sister Chamberlain. Sister Chamberlain. She has married a man 30 years her senior, old Solomon Chamberlain, old man's Chamberlain, who lives fairly close to the Crosbys. So she comes to the Crosby house discouraged. And she said an evil and false report was in circulation about her, which made her feel very bad, and said she wished to leave this place as no one had any confidence in her here. Then nothing. She apparently stays because in April, old man Chamberlain comes to the house and he's complaining that she had threatened his life and struck him with a stick of wood and it caused blood to run freely. Now there's little interaction between Olivia and Carolyn through this period. I think Olivia is wary of Carolyn's willingness to take her children, to be frank, or perhaps of Caroline's judgment. Although in May of 1860, Emily comes to the house and asks to borrow a book for her mother. I think it's interesting. Their mother sent a religious periodical, The Millennial Star. And that's about it. It suggests, however, that Olivia is still struggling, perhaps with alcohol. It seems quite likely. Now, to summarize, Caroline's diary actually confirms several things that are in Henry Lunt's letter to Brigham Young about the migrations of Olivia Coombs and her having several husbands. We know that she was married to Solomon Chamberlain for a time. And although it isn't a direct proof of her leaving to go to Santa Clara, far to the south, 100 miles south of Beaver, lots of people are leaving, including Chamberlain himself. And that's recorded in Caroline's diary. And Caroline also records the massive flood that destroyed Santa Clara in January of 1862. So she wasn't able to stay long there. And that lets us know that when she comes to Cedar City, she's coming as a refugee, having moved. She brings her children with her to Cedar City. We know that all 4 are there. And it's fascinating that in 3 days after the murder in Cedar City, Caroline notes it in her diary in Beaver. News traveled fast. She even notes, and this is really interesting because this is also in Lunt's letter, that Olivia had recently married Elias Higbee, who runs the carding mill. So Caroline's patient accounting of family life gives us an approach to Olivia Coombs that is important. It tells us that she has problems and that there's instability in her life, but it also tells us that she has the kind of energy to keep this kind of pioneer energy to try to make a new start, constantly moving. It also tells us, and I think this is significant, that she has a great passion for holding on to her children. So what do we do then with a story that Olive Milburn told Juanita Brooks? Well, I want to go back and look at that story again. And I want to think about it a little differently than I did the first time. It seems to me, if you look at the structure of this story, that the first 2 paragraphs, which are all about the curious woman who's interested in the Mount Miller massacre, are really a kind of overlay on the central point, which comes at the very end of the story. And that is that the trigger for the murder was Wood's belief that his son was interested in Coombs' 13-year-old daughter. I think that Milburn's story really does substantiate the general argument that the trigger, if not the full meaning of this event, had to do with this question of patriarchal control over the sexual behavior of dependents, in this case, a son as well as a daughter, and the willingness to him to strike out and kill someone through that authority. But there's something else in this story that I think is really important. And if we look at it through the vantage point of 1950 rather than 1862, it jumps out quite clearly. So the emphasis on Olivia Coombs' learning, her intelligence, her curiosity, her ambition, her desire to collect evidence, to publish her findings, that she is a teacher, but she's trying to fix past crimes on their parents. And this is elaborated in a document that Olive Milbourne's sister published in 1963, in which she claimed her brilliant mother, never mentions the murder, but she describes her brilliant mother who died young, who before she joined the church had studied at New York University. We look at this story of the brilliant woman who arouses animosity among her male neighbors. And the thing that strikes me quite powerfully is how much it describes Juanita Brooks. In the 1830s, no young woman in New York could have attended New York University, an elite school that did not admit women. But in 1928, Juanita Pulsifer, who was a widow, supporting her son by teaching, did go to New York and got a graduate degree at Columbia University. And she did arouse suspicion and concern among her neighbors, so much so the famous story of hiding her work under her ironing, lest the neighbors come to the house. She was never threatened with murder or violence. I'm not saying that Olive Milbourne is subconsciously writing about Juanita Brooks. I'm just pointing to a kind of innate understanding between the storyteller and the listener that made this story ring true. It sounded true because it was something that I think both of them understood from their own experience. Because Olive Milbourne is also very interested in history and in genealogy, and has been working for 20 years on what will be her massive history diary and genealogy of her father, William Henry Branch, which includes a history of the entire family going back in time and also those who were still living up to 1953. It's a very up-to-date, amazing genealogical work. And what's especially interesting is that work, of course, includes Juanita Brooks' husband, Will. Olive Branch Milbourne's father, William Henry Branch, is Will Brooks' grandfather. They, of course, descend from different wives. The second young wife, the Branch married in old age, is Olivia Coombs' second youngest daughter, Elvira, the little girl that Caroline Crosby wanted to adopt. There's another strange little piece in Milbourne's story that intrigued me when I first time read it. And that's the reference to a small hotel where men gathered to visit and drink. Somehow it didn't quite ring true as a description of Cedar City in this period, partly because it was such a mess and also very much under the control at the moment of attempted control by church authorities. But that was not true of the town where Olive Branch grew up, which was Price, Utah, mining, a railroad town, very, very rough. And Olive Branch Milburn, who was born in Price in 78, married Herbert Milburn in 1897 when she was 19 years old. Herbert was the son of the local saloon owner, John Milburn, a veteran of the Klondike, the Colorado mines, a rough and tough guy, very popular in the town. His saloon was a rowdy place. And in 1905, he was shot and killed after a drunken encounter with the local sheriff. The murder was pronounced justified. She understood violence. She understood what could happen with guns. She understood what it meant when men became excited over any issue and needed to assert their power. She also understood motherhood, family, and the desire to build continuity through generations. She and her mother are both written about in lavish terms by their descendants of having been strong and loyal members of the church. And the stories that Olive Branch Milburn told include that memorial. She served a mission for the church at the age of 71 and left in 1950. And here she is with her mother, Ella Elvira Coombs, her daughter, and her first grandchild. Olive Branch Milburn told two stories about her family, her magnum opus, The Family History, which has amazing details buried in it, but never says a word about the murder. So I will leave you to ponder these three stories and the puzzles that they unfold.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ulrich. That was very fascinating and quite moving to hear. We've got two questions that have already been asked in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in just a second. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and start putting those in, and I'll read you the first one. It comes from Star. Was his reason of killing, this is a quote, killing the whore being a benefit to the world, unquote, justification that made him think it was okay to confess to the priest that he had just murdered Olivia? Was he really confident in his actions?
Was he confident in his actions? I think, yes. I think that's what he said. I have the right to do this. Anybody else interferes with my family, I'll do it again. Yeah, that's that patriarchal voice, I think.
Okay, so we have another question coming from Vinny, and he asked, is it possible that she was ostracized by the community for being an outsider and a non-conforming woman of higher ed? Do you think that might contribute to the malicious penning of that petition?
Well, that's certainly what her granddaughter implied in the story that she wrote in 1950. She was shamed in her community, I think, not initially, but she came into Cedar City as a stranger with no resources, with little kids, and with a reputation, I think, of having not slept around, changed partners pretty often over time. And so I think that put her in a very vulnerable position. It's outrageous, though, that she's now dead. I mean, even if she had been a prostitute, that's not a capital crime So the fact of her defense is just stunning, and I think needs a lot more investigation as to other motives that might have been involved. The largest one, I think, is that George Wood was a good businessman and rancher. He was a hot-headed guy. That's well documented. But they kind of needed him, I think. And it was very, very hard in this period. This is not just about Utah, it's true nationally. Very few people convicted of murder actually serve out their terms. That prisons aren't set up for life imprisonment. So they're all, but we haven't studied that in Utah. Mainly case studies, but there's no kind of comprehensive, systematic study of murder. Who are the victims? Who are the perpetrators? What kind of terms do they serve? And I think that would be a great topic for, if there are students in the audience, that would be a great topic to work with.
Absolutely, I agree. Alyssa says that she just wants to say a midwife's tale changed her life as a history major and inspired her to pursue history as a profession. So she's very excited and grateful for you. Let's see. Tammy wants to know, what did you find out about George's son, Joseph?
Well, that's just a fabulously interesting story. And I haven't done as much research on that as Melanie Sturgeon has, but Joseph grew up. I mean, you can imagine maybe he got a beating from his father. I mean, he's just sort of missing from the account of the event. But he did grow up and he married one of John D. Lee's daughters. And later in life, he was involved in a murder case that had to do with cattle stealing. It was a frontier event. But again, we need to study these events. They're virtually unstudied in Utah, except for particular very interesting case studies.
So Joe has a very quick question. He wants to know if she was a madam.
No, I don't think she had the capacity to do that, or if there was such a thing in this little town. We're talking about towns with several hundred people, you know. So I think that's what I think is so fascinating about this petition. That's the implication. It would take a lot to convince me that that was actually the case. But she may have been sleeping with men without benefit of marriage, although divorce is very easy in this period. She divorced Coombs easily in Utah in a way she could not have done in California. And Old Man Chamberlain's wife had recently divorced him before he married Olivia. This is not well known, but Utah was the divorce capital of the West in this period.
Yes, it was. Okay, Steve has a question. He asks, how much do you encounter embellishment and invention in family histories told by family members?
Well, you could probably answer that a lot. But you know, I think I don't trust family stories, but I love them. Because if you look at them to try to get the facts of something that happened a century ago, you're going to run into a lot of discrepancies, as we did with this story. If you look at them to understand how people understand and cope with the past, you can learn a lot. And that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize here. We understand history through our own experience. And one of the challenges of serious study of history is to find ways to enter another world and try to see things from a perspective that is not our own.
I agree. So we've got a couple of questions that are more, I think, clarifications. One of them wants to know that did Wood go to kill Emily and Olivia Coombs because of sexual fantasies?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, particularly in the light of the recent situation in Georgia. You know, she's an older woman, as some of those women in Georgia were. And it's just so bizarre that he's talking about adultery between two teenagers. It makes no sense. Technically, this is fornication, whatever it is, but he's blaming the mother. And that may be, again, part of this general patriarchal mindset that the parents are responsible for the behavior of their children. Olivia has no husband. She's a dangerous woman. You know, she's letting her daughter do things she shouldn't do. So he goes after the mother and the daughter.
So we have two questions that kind of talk about this unspoken rule and when did that come about and how was it used as a justification for killing?
It's some people argue, particularly those who follow it, that this is an ancient rule that's just embedded in moral law. But the best recent scholarship really believes that it developed in the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, and was endemic in Britain and the United States as they were coping with the systemization of legal systems. And maybe I can use an analogy to something seemingly unrelated. And that is vigilantism in a newly developed community. And you hear this argument between Wood and Lunt. Lunt says, we'll hold a council. You know, we'll get together, the wise men of the town, and we'll figure out what to do. And you can just sort of hear Wood saying, oh yeah, those councils, they never do anything, they never do anything. Maybe that's what happened with the siege on the US Capitol. Men with guns saying, hey, people are not solving this problem. We're going to solve it right now. We're going to take it into our own hands. So it's a form of vigilante, of direct action, circumventing representative or legal structures.
Yes. Okay. So we've got another question coming from Brant. He asks, how/where did you perform research for this project? And did the pandemic impact or limit your ability to conduct research?
Yes, to the second question, although it's amazing how much you can do online now if you have access to a major research library, which fortunately I do, and also if you have friends who are willing to track things down for you. A lot of the work depended, however, on my earlier scholarship in my book on 19th century Mormon diaries. And in that book, I devoted an entire chapter to Caroline Crosby's life in San Bernardino, California. And I discovered Olivia Coombs' murder, but there was no place for that story in the book that I was writing. But I remembered it, and I had presence of mind to get photocopies of the transcript of the unpublished part of Crosby's diaries. So I had those in my house. And this was an opportunity to dig into something that I'd wanted to do for some time.
I like when that always works out. You had that paper there for a reason. We keep those, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Kaylin makes a very interesting comment. She says her husband is a direct descendant of George Wood, and they didn't know about his conviction. So,
Oh, really? Oh,
my
that's
one of those times
wonderful.
where family
See,
history doesn't tell you.
well, there are people on certain genealogical websites attacking him viciously. So you might want to check that. You might want to check that out on your own. I mean, it's, yeah, we defend our relatives, don't we? And he did. He apparently lived a responsible, upright life the rest of his life. But you can investigate that. Let me know what you find.
Okay, Heather thanks you for the wonderful lecture, and she asks if you can tell us more about the unusual case of a father killing to defend his son from seduction, and why would he feel the need to do that? She has a third part to this question, but the petition had 200 people sign it. She's wondering if any of them were women.
No women, these are male. This is before women were politically active, although not very long before. In Utah, as I hope you know, they only went to men. The jurors, the men who had been on the grand jury, many of them signed it. The judge signed it. I think I'm working on that. And I'm trying to identify the petition signers. But this is a case where I feel like I really need to see the original petition if it survives, because that will tell me a lot about the sequence of signing, the ink used. Somebody went out and gathered those petitions, and I have not found very many of those who signed it coming from Beaver. That is, they're gathering petitions that people who never knew Olivia Coombs or anything about it, they're signing it sort of on faith that there's this threat of prostitution. And of course, we're going to stand up for George Wood. So that needs a lot more investigation. That's a really good question.
I agree. So Brendan asks, as a historian, how do you go about vetting the charges that men made against women in a patriarchal society like the 19th century Utah? And you always have to take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah. Well, 19th century Utah is very, very interesting because we do have a lot of detailed descriptions among diarists about daily life and just common things. So often people reveal themselves unintentionally by what they care about and what they write down. We also have incredible records. For example, divorce records that, that describe what Olivia said. Now, she's writing to the law. She's writing the things that will allow her to get the divorce, but they're rather remarkable because they suggest harmony and peace and love are the purpose of marriage. They really amazingly undercut the patriarchalism that is embedded in other aspects of Utah law, like polygamy. So the counterbalance to polygamy, which is inherently patriarchal, is this liberal divorce system, which says nobody has to stay within polygamy or stay with any man, monogamous or polygamous. So we have this weird combination of incredible liberalism and seemingly old-fashioned patriarchy happening in the same place, in the same system.
That's very true. We have a question from Braden. And so he wants to know, if Olivia was really sleeping with all of these men, her husbands, don't you think one of these men would have gotten jealous and killed her out of vengeance if she had actually been a prostitute?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe yes, maybe no. And we need to look at the men involved. Obviously, Solomon Chamberlain had had enough and was ready to divorce her. And he didn't charge her with prostitution. He charged her with violence, which makes me wonder if she'd been drinking, she's resisting him, something happened, she picked up a stick of wood. We don't know what happened in that incident. But the other men, I haven't really been able to locate. Thomas Hunt, the one that she apparently was with in Santa Clara. It's a hard name to find. I do know something about the man who was running the carding mill, and he was a lifelong bachelor or widower. He came on the Overland Trail with a son, raised the son alone, apparently, ended up, a responsible person, but he traveled a lot. He would travel from place to place. He had this mechanical ability to run the carding mill. So he may have just thought, well, she can cook my dinner. She's convenient to have around, but may not have been really invested and may not have been actually formally married. That's, it's an awful lot of marriages pretty fast, and there would have had to have been some kind of divorce to have a legal marriage. So I think it was more kind of common law and maybe Lunt's courtesy calling them marriages.
Gotcha. Okay, so I have a question from Lisa. She said, was there any evidence beyond idle gossip that the teenagers were really sexually active?
No. And it may or may not have been idle gossip. We don't really know, do we? And this is one of the many things we don't know. It could have been rape for all we know, right?
I mean, the daughter was 13.
Yeah. Yeah. She was actually 16. Yeah, that's another one of the embellishments in Milburn's, or just she didn't know. The birth date is disputed, shows up in different places, but I'm pretty sure she was 16 at the time, which
that's not quite
still doesn't mean she should have been hit over the head and shot. Yeah.
Brendan asks, what inspires you to uncover the stories of women who would otherwise be overlooked in the historical record?
Well, I'm hoping that as we become more aware of our history, we can also become more conscious of our own power and authority and the ability to make a difference in the world. So that's one motivation. Another is I'm just very, very interested in ordinary lives of men and of women in the past. And I don't think we understand any human society if we only look at the male side of it.
I agree. We have 2 questions still on the books for you. Hope asks, so she says, it sounds like you don't think the murder has anything to do with the Mountain Meadows massacre. At least your research doesn't go in that direction. Is that correct?
I found no evidence of that. The timing is wrong. The scholars who have worked most directly on the massacre have found no direct link between, there seems no logic to Wood having been driven by that motivation. He wasn't vulnerable, apparently, to being accused of participating in the massacre. But there's so much we don't know. So we have to focus on what we do know. And I think what we do know is pretty interesting and deserves more investigation.
I agree. So the last question we have is, do you know what happened to the daughter who was attempted to be murdered? And did she fully recover?
It's really hard to know. There were 4 daughters, and the 3 little ones, younger ones, I think they were 8, 7, and 4, were all adopted out, placed out, the last thing their mother wanted, but they were all placed into different families. And they all seem to have grown up, these 3 younger daughters. Very committed Mormons in Cedar City, married with families that are well known, grew up, had families of their own. The older one, Emily, really, according to any of the family accounts, suffered from the wound. Some of them said she had brain fever. Some said she had seizures. Some said she had temporary insanity, but none of them seemed to know much about her. She seems to have left because she was older. She went apparently to Salt Lake and then may have married a Civil War veteran and moved to Wyoming. And then she kind of disappears. People think they have found her in all kinds of places, but if you really look closely at the genealogical evidence they're offering, it's very shaky. So we know much less about her. And I think we can safely conclude that she was damaged. I mean, she was pretty conscious. She was old enough, she absolutely knew and would have remembered this horrible moment in her life.
Okay, that is all the questions we have for you today. So thank you. This was amazing. And it was very great to hear this coming from such an expert on this field. I really appreciate it. And I know a lot of our panelists did as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody who joined. Like I said, we will have this lecture posted online next week on the library's website. I will send it out as a campus announcement. If you're off campus, feel free to email me directly. My name is kathleen.broder@dixie.edu, and I will send you the link then as well, okay? Thank you all for joining us and have a lovely night.
Thank you.